To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
Imagine being just 5 years old. You hear your mother cry out, then suddenly, silence. For the next 3 days, you sit in your home, confused, scared, and waiting for someone to come. This was Jeremy's reality in February of 1996. His mother, Jasmine Jazzie Porter, was 36 years old, living in the Bronx and 6 months pregnant. She was working hard to build a better life for her family. But one night, everything changed. Jasmine was killed inside her apartment while her young son was there. For decades, her case went unsolved. Evidence sat in storage, leads went nowhere, and her family was left searching for answers. Until a detective took another look. With the help of modern DNA technology, investigators were finally able to identify her killer more than 25 years later. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 297, The Murder of Jasmine Jazzie Porter. Jasmine Porter, known to her family and friends as Jazzie, was 36 years old in 1996. She lived in the Bronx with her 5-year-old son, Jeremy, and was expecting another child. At 6 months pregnant, she was preparing to welcome a new baby into the world while raising her young son all on her own. Friends described Jazzie as warm, outgoing, and devoted to her family. She was a gifted singer who loved being a mother and poured everything she had into making sure that Jeremy grew up surrounded by love and stability. Life wasn't always easy, but she worked hard to provide for him and create a safe home. From everything I read about her, Jasmine's nickname of Jazzie reflected her personality perfectly. She was the type of person who could light up a room, someone others gravitated toward. She enjoyed music, laughter, and spending time with her family. For 5-year-old Jeremy, she wasn't just a parent, but his entire world. In the mid-1990s, the Bronx was going through a pretty tough time. Crime rates were high, and many neighborhoods were struggling with things like poverty and violence. Even the rest of the country was struggling. The U.S. had at least 340,000 unsolved homicides during the past 60 years, according to the FBI. Most of these cases eventually turn cold if the police don't get any good leads. But Jazzie did the best she could to shield her son from all of this. She had dreams of raising her children with opportunities that she never had. That's just one of the many reasons why what happened on February 5th, 1996 was so devastating. Not only was a mother taken far too soon, but a family's future was shattered in an instant. When officers arrived at Jazzie's 2-bedroom apartment on Davidson Avenue in the Bronx, they found her body right away. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Next to her was 5-year-old Jeremy, trying to wipe the blood coming from her nose. He had been with her alone inside of that apartment for the past 3 days. Neighbors later recalled that it was a cold winter day, one of those gray New York mornings where the city feels quiet. Besides finding Jazzie's lifeless body on her bed, the rest of the apartment was spotless. All their laundry and clothes had been neatly put away in the drawers. The dishes were all clean, nothing was in the sink, and Jeremy's room was immaculate. All of his toys were neatly put away. Everything looked completely normal, except nothing about it was normal. Jazzie had been murdered 3 days earlier, and her son had been forced to witness the entire thing. He was only 5 years old, far too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to remember that something was terribly wrong. For 3 days, he stayed by her side, waiting for someone to come through the front door. He didn't have the ability to pick up the phone and call for help. He didn't know who to turn to. He just waited. An article from the New York Times reported that he even tried using an ice cube to keep her awake at one point. Finally, after a few of Jazzie's neighbors hadn't seen her in a couple of days, they decided it was time to call the police. Jazzie had always been very friendly and very outgoing, so it was strange for them not to see her around the apartment complex. And when they stopped by her particular unit to check on her, no one answered the door. So that's when they decided it was time to call the police to have someone officially come and check on her and make sure everything was okay. The apartment itself became the first crime scene. Detectives quickly secured the space and began their search for evidence. They noted signs of a struggle and collected everything they could: fingerprints, trace materials, and fingernail scrapings from Jazzie. But in the mid-1990s, DNA testing wasn't very good. Samples could be collected, but databases were small and technology was extremely limited. But even given all of these limitations, detectives preserved everything, hoping that one day they might provide some answers. Outside of the apartment, they canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with neighbors. They questioned Jazzie's friends and family. One New York detective delayed retirement just so he could work on the case. But there was always one reoccurring theme. Jazzie didn't seem to have a single enemy. They couldn't find anyone who had a motive to want her dead. No one reported seeing a suspicious person enter or leave her apartment that day. No one heard anything beyond what could have been dismissed as ordinary city noise. Jeremy was taken into protective care. Imagine being just 5 years old and leaving your home behind with police officers, knowing your mom wasn't coming back. His young life would have changed forever in those 2-3 days. In those first few moments after the attack, Jeremy tried to make sense of what he had seen. He remembered seeing his mother crying out for help, urging him to run. After that, after the man left, Jeremy went to her side. At 5 years old, his instinct was to comfort her in the only way he knew how. It was a heartbreaking glimpse of his innocence and of how much he wanted to protect his mom. But Jeremy was only a child. He had seen fragments of what happened, yet he was too young to be a reliable witness. For investigators, his memory offered pieces of the puzzle, but not enough to identify who was responsible. The biggest challenge early on was the lack of obvious leads. I already mentioned that Jazzie didn't have any known enemies, and she wasn't involved in any type of risky behavior that might explain why she'd be murdered. She was just a hardworking, single mom who went to work each day to try to provide the best life possible for herself and Jeremy. So investigators had to consider two very different possibilities. Was this a random attack? Or could she have been targeted for a reason that no one knew about? But Because this was 1996, none of the forensic evidence inside of Jazzie's apartment could answer that question. DNA testing was possible, but slow, expensive, very limited. Databases like CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was still being developed. And even if they tested any of the evidence, there wasn't much hope of finding a match unless the perpetrator had already been convicted of another violent crime and entered into the system. So from an evidence standpoint, identifying Jazzie's killer was an uphill battle from the very beginning. The first 3 months of the investigation went by relatively uneventfully. It wasn't until May that investigators got their first big lead. That month, a man was arrested and charged in the case. At first, everyone was happy. It seemed like they had finally found the guy. But there was a huge problem with the case against him. At the trial, it was discovered that a key witness who identified him as Jazzie's killer had lied. He never saw him at the scene. So when this witness admitted to lying, the entire case against him was dropped, and the man was acquitted. After that, Jazzie's murder case went cold, ice cold. For Jeremy and the Porter family, the lack of progress had to be absolutely devastating. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone was overshadowed by the same unanswered questions. Who killed Jazzie and why? Was it someone she knew and trusted, and that's why they were inside of her apartment? Or was it a stranger who somehow conned his way inside? For the New York detectives who had once worked the case, it became another haunting file on the shelf, waiting for technology or luck to catch up. Fast forward nearly a quarter century to 2020 when everything changed. NYPD detective Robert Klein, working in the Bronx Homicide Squad's cold case unit, got a call from a local prosecutor. The prosecutor told him that some local inmates had been talking, sharing details about an old murder. The name that kept coming up, Jasmine Porter. Klein, who had built a reputation for chasing down forgotten files, knew this was the kind of tip he couldn't ignore. About a month later, Detective Klein started digging. He went down to the basement of the 46th precinct, where stacks of old cardboard boxes held decades of unsolved files. He searched through case after case, dust-covered folders piled high, but he came up empty. The following month, Klein decided to check in with his boss, Lieutenant Sean O'Toole. O'Toole had a reputation as the precinct's unofficial historian. He'd kept track of hundreds of cold case files carefully organized in his office. Klein walked in and asked, half jokingly, "Give me something good, Lou." And without missing a beat, O'Toole pulled a thick accordion-style folder from his cabinet, handed it over, and said, "You should have come to me first." Back at his desk, Klein opened the file. Inside were photographs of Jazzie's apartment, her kitchen, her bedroom, her living room. He noticed how tidy the space looked, even frozen in time on glossy photographs. The folder also contained interview notes, forensic reports, and autopsy findings confirming that Jazzie had been 6 months pregnant when she'd been killed. And then something caught his eye. A line in one of the reports mentioned that Jazzie's fingernail clippings had been collected, but never tested. Detective Klein immediately recognized the potential. If she had scratched her attacker, there was a chance his DNA might still be underneath her fingernails. 2 days later, Klein called the office of the chief medical examiner, but they warned him it could take months to find the clippings, if they even still existed. But for the first time in years, Klein felt like they had a real lead here, something no other investigator assigned to the case had. After hanging up with the medical examiner's office, Detective Klein did what seasoned investigators do. He didn't just sit back and wait. In the weeks that followed, he tracked down a couple of people of interest who at the time had been loosely connected to the case. He even interviewed them, hoping one might finally provide the missing piece of the puzzle. But the conversations essentially went nowhere. Nothing new surfaced. Then in the spring of 2021, months after that first phone call, Klein received the update he'd been waiting for. The medical examiner's office had found Jazzie's fingernail clippings, carefully preserved for the last 25 years. They said the evidence was still intact and that they were going to send the clippings for DNA testing. But the results didn't come quickly. Still, though, Detective Klein waited. He waited through the long months of summer and fall, knowing that this was his best chance at solving the case. Finally, just before Thanksgiving, the call came in. They had a DNA match. The DNA belonged to a man named Gregory Fleetwood. From that moment on, Detective Klein began digging into Gregory Fleetwood's background, and what he found was very troubling. He learned that Fleetwood had a long, violent history involving women. 12 years before Jazzie was murdered, another young woman had been attacked. Her name was Denise Wiggins, a 21-year-old woman who had grown up in the Bronx. On August 6, 1984, Denise Wiggins and her friend rode the train together into Manhattan. Also on board that train was Gregory Fleetwood, someone Denise only knew as a, quote, loner who lived across the street from her, end quote. After the train ride, Denise didn't see Gregory Fleetwood until around 6 o'clock that evening, when she walked around the corner of a deli store and felt a large hand grab her from behind. And when she turned around, she said she saw Fleetwood. According to Denise, he then dragged her up to an apartment and held her there for about 13 hours, and he repeatedly sexually assaulted her. According to an article by the New York Times, at one point during this whole ordeal, she said he choked her until she passed out, and when she woke up, he told her she was allowed to leave. That's when Denise returned back to her own apartment, went to her room, and fell asleep. Later on, she went to the police station and filed an official police report about what had happened to her. And on August 8th, 1984, Gregory Fleetwood was charged with first-degree rape. But the charges wouldn't stick. After pressure from her own family members, Denise went back to the police and said that she didn't want to proceed with the charges. So after spending 6 days in custody, Fleetwood was released and the case completely fell apart. If Denise, as the victim, wouldn't testify, there was no case for prosecutors to go after. So Fleetwood became a free man to hurt another young woman. 3 years later, he was at it again. In August of 1987, police were called to an apartment on Corsa Avenue in the Bronx, where Fleetwood had been staying. The call came from Fleetwood himself. When officers arrived, they found the body of Linda Miller, a 25-year-old pregnant woman from Paterson, New Jersey, lying on a bed inside of the apartment. Fleetwood was waiting outside when the cops showed up. He told him that he had met Linda Miller earlier that day on the street, and the two of them had gone back to the apartment to use drugs. He even admitted to smoking crack with her. According to his statement, the night spiraled into violence. He confessed to striking Miller several times before eventually falling asleep. And when he woke up, he claimed she was dead. Before police arrived, Fleetwood admitted he had tried to clean the room, and the medical examiner later determined that Linda Miller had been strangled to death. After that, Fleetwood was arrested and originally charged with second-degree murder, but prosecutors eventually agreed to a plea deal, reducing the charge to first-degree manslaughter. He went to prison in December of 1988, but you might be surprised to find out that just 6 years later, on August 4th, 1994, the New York Parole Board approved his release, the very first day he was eligible. After serving just over 6 years behind bars, Fleetwood walked free and returned right back to Davidson Avenue in the Bronx. By the summer of 2022, Detective Robert Klein had spent nearly 2 years methodically building his case against Gregory Fleetwood. He had poured himself into the investigation, answering late-night calls from the Porter family, reassuring them that progress was in fact being made. Inside the thick case file, he kept a photograph of Jazzie smiling, a reminder of the person behind the paperwork and why he refused to give up. Normally, an arrest like this would have been handled by the NYPD's Violent Felony Squad, but Klein wanted to be there from start to finish. He had carried the case this far, and he was determined to see it through, to be the one who finally put handcuffs on Jazzie's killer. On the morning of August 8th, Klein and his team pulled up in an unmarked car outside of Fleetwood's apartment building on Laconia Avenue, just 5 miles from where Jazzie had been killed. They parked with a clear view of the entrance and waited. Hours went by. Finally, after nearly 6 hours of watching, Klein saw him, a tall, thin man in a white t-shirt and gym shorts, stepping out of the building. There was no doubt about it. It was Fleetwood. Detective Klein got out of the car and approached. At 6'2", Fleetwood was almost eye to eye with him. But the man standing before him wasn't the monster that Klein had imagined for all of these years. He looked quiet, even unassuming, caught off guard by what was happening. Klein then told him there was a case against him and that they would be taking him down to the police station. Fleetwood didn't resist as they put the handcuffs on him. Calmly, Klein took him by the arm and led him toward the waiting car. Later that day, Gregory Fleetwood was formally charged with second-degree murder. After more than 25 years, the Porter family finally had a name, a face, and an arrest. What ultimately cracked this case wasn't a new witness or a sudden confession. It was the evidence collected back in 1996 and carefully preserved for decades. The fingernail clippings stored in the medical examiner's archives turned out to be the key. When someone fights back against an attacker, even in the most desperate moments, tiny traces of evidence can be left behind. Skin cells, blood, or other microscopic material may be trapped beneath the nails. In Jazzie's case, that evidence survived 25 years, long enough for technology to catch up. We all know that DNA analysis has advanced dramatically since the mid-1990s. Back when this crime happened, testing required larger, cleaner samples, and the National DNA Database, CODIS, was still just being built. Today, forensic scientists can develop full genetic profiles from even tiny or degraded samples, and those profiles can be run through state and national databases containing millions of offender profiles. That's exactly what happened here. Once the clippings were tested, the results produced a clear match back to Gregory Fleetwood, a man who was already in the system for his prior conviction. Without that preservation of evidence, and without the ability of modern labs to analyze small, decades-old samples, this case might have never been solved. But as a person who truly believes in our justice system, this case is still pending in court. Fleetwood has been charged with second-degree murder, but under the law, he's presumed innocent until proven guilty. From everything I found, no trial date has been set yet, and prosecutors haven't identified a clear motive. What makes the case even more unsettling is that both Jasmine Porter and Fleetwood's earlier victim, Linda Miller, were pregnant when their lives were taken. Whether that detail is a coincidence or not, investigators haven't been able to explain that. But it's a fact that definitely lingers in the background of this case. For now, the focus remains on the evidence and the long path it took to get here. So did Fleetwood know Jazzie? I don't know. How did he manage to get inside of her apartment? Again, I don't know. There are still so many unanswered questions about this case that hopefully a trial will eventually be able to answer some of them. But for the sake of this episode, I don't want to speculate about a possible motive. Let's all wait for Gregory Fleetwood's day in court, whenever that will happen. But I think it's important to say that Jazzie's case is a powerful example of how forensic science and investigative persistence can converge. A small detail preserved at a crime scene, overlooked in one era, can later become the turning point in another. It's why cold cases are never truly closed, because technology and determination can still bring answers. There's still one person in this story I want to talk about. About 7 months after Fleetwood's arrest, Detective Robert Klein arranged to meet Jeremy Porter at a diner on Long Island. Jeremy was no longer the little boy who lived through the unthinkable. He was now 32 years old. After his mother's death, Jeremy was raised by his grandmother in rural Sullivan County, New York. She was very protective, often too afraid to let him out of her sight. So during his teenage years, they were very structured and very cautious. At 16, while his friends were going to the movies on Friday nights, Jeremy often stayed home. Summers were spent riding the bus to his first job, a federal work-study program that paid about $300 a week. He used that money to help his grandmother cover the household expenses. As he got older, Jeremy moved to Albany for college courses before eventually settling in Rochester. Today, he works as a plumber and has built a life with his girlfriend of nearly 7 years. Until the arrest, even she didn't know the full details about his mother's murder. It just wasn't something that Jeremy talked about. Without the case being reopened, he said he might not have ever talked to her about it. On March 9th, 2022, in the parking lot of the Peter Pan Diner, Jeremy showed up wearing dark glasses, a leather jacket, and black Converse sneakers. Detective Klein, dressed in a suit and tie, stood beside him. Klein put an arm around Jeremy's shoulder, and the two smiled for a photograph before going their separate ways. It was a quiet moment, but one that spoke volumes about the long journey they both had taken. One as the son of a victim, the other as the detective who refused to let her case stay cold. A link to that New York Times article with the photograph will be listed on our website about the case. In the end, this case is about persistence, a detective who refused to stop digging, a family who never gave up hope, and a 5-year-old boy who grew up to carry his mother's memory into adulthood. finally hearing that someone was held responsible for what happened all those years ago. This is also a case I'll be following closely. If and when there are updates in court, I'll be sharing them with listeners on our Patreon page. Cases like Jasmine Porter's reminds us that justice is a process, sometimes painfully slow, and keeping the conversation alive is one way to honor the victims and their families. To share your thoughts on this week's episode, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to hear my personal take on the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode where I share my personal thoughts on the case in more detail. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you never miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, please consider leaving us a positive review. It helps the show grow. You can also support the show through Patreon. Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to tune in next week for a new case. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Marianne C., Lois B., Lynn H., Ashley H., Danielle D., Chrissy D., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Christine K. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.